Well, it was a year ago at this time, in the beginning of the summer of 27, that we began a summer-long series called Life Race, Running Like Paul. And I know how much you all just love and groove on all of my running stories and illustrations. So to not disappoint you, let me begin the summer series of 2018 in the same way. You know, it was during my Dallas and my New Jersey years prior to coming here to Maryland 24 years ago, in my 20s and 30s, that I really was into running personally, marathons and road races, and you have to kind of accept that by faith at this point. But and I was actually a local running writer for the newspaper and contributed articles to running journals and magazines and things like that. And I also, at the previous church where I was pastor in New Jersey, I hosted an annual race in November. It was called the Phillipsburg Turkey Trot. And I was just thinking back, it would be 30 years ago this coming fall that I had a seminary friend, a guy that I went to Dallas Theological Seminary with. There were two guys there at school who were world-class runners and made the Olympic team, you know, the one that never made it to, because it was in Russia and they boycotted and all that. But I had him come on this one particular occasion, do a running clinic and dinner on Friday night. We did the race then on a Saturday morning. And also attending that event was a local friend of mine, a guy who had been my best friend through childhood, all through high school. And he was a high school teammate with me in the cross-country team. And I happened to see him this past week, and I was reminded of this story that I think kind of leads us into some of our ideas today. And so my friend he's actually from Oregon, from the Athletics West Track Club in Oregon, he was a presenter who said, you know, to run your best, he said, in the clinic, what you have to do is you have to get your body really warmed up at a high level, essentially coming to the starting line of the race, already having worked up a really serious sweat from having run several miles fairly hard. And I recall going to the start line then the next day, and I had the gun in my hand. I was going to give the final instructions, start the race. And just as I was about to do that, my old friend comes up, and he's just totally soaked. And I did it. I did what Lodwick said last night we're supposed to do. Can't think this is going to work, but I did it. He's going to the Olympics. I'm not. All right. So, you know, and I kind of laughed and started the race. And well, though my friend was not among the leaders at the end, he did end up running an amazingly fast time that day, faster than he or I had ever run in high school or any other time of our lives. And so the strategy worked. So did I ever do it? No. I always figured my first couple miles were plenty warm up enough. But maybe I could have been world class, I could have been Taylor Oliver maybe if I'd done that. I don't know. But the whole idea of getting yourself out there and completely exhausted with a heavy, sweat-drenched workout before you even begin the race, that seems so crazy. It seems so wrong, but it really does actually work. It's because it's kind of like having a race car warmed up. I mean, you wouldn't take a race car out in the track without warming up the engine, boom, and floor it, make it go. So it seems a little bit crazy. It seems a little bit unconventional. It seems to be against common sense, what you would naturally expect. And we have a word for that in the English language for things that are like that. The word is counterintuitive. Counterintuitive. And that's a title word for our summer series. So what does that mean? You might think, I've never heard that word used in the Bible. But trust me, believe me, when I tell you that the concept of doing things that are counterintuitive, it's really a biblical concept that's seen in the scriptures over and over. So here's our introductory summary. You'll see it in the brochure today that you have in your newsletter. Our introductory summary here for the Counterintuitive Instinct Busters of Faith series we're going to do this summer. It says counterintuitive by definition. Counter to what intuition would lead one to expect. Something not easily understood in an instinctive, unconscious way. And as we grow in faith and in the knowledge of the Scriptures, we learn that God's way is not the way of our instincts. love your enemies, strive to be a servant, gaining the most by giving the most, greatness through weakness. These and other themes were modeled by Christ Jesus, and our calling is to take up our cross and follow him. Another counterintuitive thing. And the way to the top is indeed through the bottom. So check that out in your newsletter today. With Summer Series, what I try to do is pick something that has kind of a theme that carries us along in a unified way through a series of messages, but also is not necessarily built on one week to the next. As I know this is, of course, the season of the year when people travel a good bit. Well, to begin, we will look at the theme today of being strong actually by being weak. And now that seems so wrong, doesn't it? We would think that our strength comes from working hard to be strong, to be aggressive, to take charge, to be in charge, to be in authority. And though we are not discrediting today the concept of responsibility and of the values of disciplines in the Christian experience in life, we are highlighting that over and over in the scriptures, and even as Christ himself taught, that there is a teaching that our strength is not in ourselves. It's not something that we generate in ourselves through our labor and our work. Our ultimate strength that leads to effectiveness is not something that's really totally sourced in ourselves. Remember in John 15, that passage where Jesus said, he said, what can you do? I'll ask, he said it as a statement, but I'll ask it as a question. What can we do without him? Nothing is the answer. You can do nothing without me, he said. And so there are more than just a couple of passages in the scriptures that we could highlight for this theme today, but what I'd like to do is for us to go to Paul's second letter to the church in Corinth in Greece, to 2 Corinthians chapter 12 today. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Here's what the first verse says. I must go on boasting. Although there is nothing to be gained, I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. That's kind of a weird first verse of a chapter, but what we're kind of doing here is we're dropping in at verse 1 on the middle of a story. And we need to kind of recall the broader story, and that whole broader story of what the second letter to the Corinthians is all about, and understanding what Paul is saying here. And the background to this is that in spite of the proclivity of the Corinthian believers to, among the varied churches of the New Testament era that received letters and visits and missions trips from Paul and so on, that these people had a particular leaning toward worldliness, toward licentious kinds of living, and they were just kind of a troublemaker bunch of the gang, you know. But Paul had a great love for this church and its people in spite of all these things. And he had literally just poured out his heart for them and serving them with his teaching and with his leadership and with his letters. And there's more than just a couple of letters that we have. There are extra letters as well we know that Paul wrote to the Corinthians to try to move them along in healthy directions. But what had happened in this body of believers is that some other teachers had come along into the church from the outside, claiming for themselves some sort of, as Paul fashions it on a couple of occasions, super apostle types of authority for themselves. And they were belittling the apostle Paul and his authority and his message and his ministry amongst them. Now, exactly who these opponents were, this is not exactly known precisely, though they claim themselves to be in the authoritative line of Moses, so they could speak with great authority relative to Old Testament truths and teachings. And they believe themselves particularly capable and able to parse that and to work it in a way that was helpful for people in that generation. But among their criticisms of Paul were of a number of things. First of all, they said he lacked their authority and their credentials connected to the church in Jerusalem. They had reproduced, in coming to Corinth, some sort of documentation of their high-level authority. And though Paul knew that this was very, very suspect at best, the Corinthians received all of this as very impressive. It was very impressive to them. And they said, secondly, that Paul was very suspect because of his many travels and his unusual adventures, sort of the inference being, why are you impressed with this fellow who goes from place to place, he gets thrown out, he gets, new place, he gets thrown out. Why are you impressed with this guy? They're kind of bringing that kind of question forward. And they implied that Paul was in this ministry business kind of thing for the personal gains that might accrue to him from it, especially as it related to offerings that Paul was collecting for the poor in Judea. It's just a passion of Paul that the very churches of the Gentile world would particularly put together some funding that would help the poor Jewish believers in bringing these disparate elements of the early church, ethnically and socially and so forth, together. But they were making it out that Paul was gaining something from this personally through it. And their overall view of Paul was that, honestly, he was not very personally impressive. Perhaps Paul was not impressive in speech or public posture. We seem to get that idea in several places, that he didn't make necessarily a grand first impression. They were especially critical of his lack of speaking abilities. For example, here is an example from the previous chapter of what we're looking at today in chapter 11, verses 5 and 6. He says, I do not think that I am the least inferior to these super apostles. I may indeed be untrained as a speaker, but I do have knowledge, and we have made this perfectly clear to you in every way. And Paul brought to them truths that had definitely changed their lives in positive directions, but he admits that he may not be the most polished fellow up front. So Paul has been put through all of this background in the unenviable position of having to defend himself and his teaching, and not because he needed it in some personal way of assurance, personally, but because he knew that the truth of the real gospel message that he had brought to them was totally at stake with these false teachers who had come in. Therefore, he had to kind of lay out his credentials to the Corinthians, that they be reminded of the credentials that came from different sources than these fellows who were there claiming to be something special. And he also lists for them an impressive listing of incredible experience that God had sustained him through. I mean, listen to this. I'll read it for you rather than put it on the screen. Just listen to this from the chapter before of some of the things that Paul says to them in terms of, well, you want to hear credentials? Here's some of what I've been through. He says, whatever anyone else dares to boast about, I'm speaking as a fool. It's kind of like, I can't believe I'm having to go through this. He says, I also dare to boast about. Are they, the super apostles, are they Hebrews? Do they have their background? Yes, so do I. Are they Israelites? Yes, so am I. Are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? And then it's kind of another face plant. I'm out of my mind to talk like this. He says, all these things, I am more. I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes -1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have gone without food. I've been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. So Paul says, you want credentials? Yeah, I got the same kinds of credentials and background and all of that as these guys. Beyond that, I have all these other experiences. But you might think a lot of these, as they were saying, a lot of these experiences aren't necessarily real positive. These are hard things that have happened. But there's a reason why that is a strength and not a weakness that we see at the end. So Paul was saying, hey, I got credentials. Not just on paper, but from real life ministry, presenting the gospel in a world that largely rejects it, just as the world largely rejected Jesus Christ. And so his actual summary of these critics, as we finish this background to set up chapter 12, his summary of them is also in the preceding chapter of our text today. Look here at verses 13 to 15. He says of them, such people are false apostles, deceitful workers, masquerading as apostles of Christ, and no wonder. For Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. It is not surprising, then, if his servants also masquerades as servants of righteousness. Boom. Okay, that's who he says these folks are. So now, in chapter 12, Paul again says, so I must go on boasting. He's talking about all these other things he's been boasting about, having to play their game for the sake of the Corinthians. And so having given his credentials, he kind of goes to a second line of authentication here, and that's what we're interested in in chapter 12 today. He says about visions and revelations. Here's that verse again. I must go on boasting. I got to play the game. All right, although there is nothing to be gained, so I don't see how this is going to help anything, but I will go on to boasting about visions and revelations from the Lord. Again, he didn't believe that any of this stuff would really build up the church, but he continues telling them a story from his own experience. And being a bit uncomfortable about it, now, in the next several verses, he will write about himself from a third-person point of view, like it was someone else talking about himself. He says, or like he's talking about someone else, I should say, and that someone else he's talking about is himself. He said, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell. This was an experience that Paul had that was very early on in his Christian life. It's not spoken of elsewhere that we read in the scriptures. It says he was caught up to heaven. For you eschatology scholars looking to the future, for future times, where it talks about the rapture of the church, the same word is used here, the catching up of the church at the end of time. And so these words and the terms he's using here for the people of that day about the third heaven, talking about paradise, these are words that would speak to that generation of him having been in this heavenly realm. And so he was caught up to this. And Paul could not honestly say if this was in the material body or merely a spiritual experience. He really didn't know. He says only God knows. But he had this experience. He had heard and received communications that were for he alone, not something that he really could share. They were something for he alone. So it's quite an extraordinary experience, and certainly something that was beyond these super apostles and any revelation or spiritual experience that they had. Not that Paul was in the game here with them of kind of a one-upsmanship competition, but since they're talking about it, he says, well, let me tell you my experience. This was my experience. So he references generally this experience. Continuing now to talk about it in the third person, verses 5 to 7, it says, I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself except about my weaknesses. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain so no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say, or because of these surprisingly great revelations. So Paul is saying here that he is willing to boast about those kinds of things, not because it's himself, that's not what he's talking about, but because of what Christ had done with such a weak person as Paul had been, knowing of his previous career of hostility to the gospel message. But Paul continues to again show his discomfort here with this external game of talking about who had the most spectacular experiences. But he said, even I have to play this game of spectacular experiences. I'm not being a fool, because what I'm saying is the truth. As I often say, it has the additional advantage of being, yes, the truth, implying that the claims he says here of his critics were likely to be indeed very suspect. Yet Paul continues to refrain from going on and on about these details of what he calls surprisingly great revelations, as drawing attention to it would draw, he feared, too much attention to himself and too much away from the preaching and the accomplishments of the gospel through his weakness. These revelations were indeed apparently just totally amazing and unique experiences. And we can sort of understand that in light of the ministry that Paul had received from God, that Paul was indeed kind of the main man. I mean, you think of the early church. Who's the main man getting it done with the gospel going around the world? It is Paul. Who's the main guy of all the writers of the New Testament that's penning the things that have informed God's people down through the ages, down to our lives today? It is Paul. And so, even the best of humans who had that kind of experience and calling from God would struggle maybe at times to be completely humble of such being such recipients of such blessing and high-level experience. But to think that oneself, maybe sometimes you think oneself, well, I really am kind of pretty special here. I mean, I'm the guy that God did this with and through, as if, he'd done anything to receive it or to make it happen. So to keep Paul from ever falling into this sort of self-aggrandizement, Paul in grace gave something else to the apostle. We read now in verse 7 to 9, it says, "Therefore, in order to keep me from being conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.'" This is from the NIV translation. The ESV, which I know many of you like, and with good reason, it repeats one phrase out of this verse. So look at here, it says, "So to keep me," here's the ESV in this verse, "So to keep me from becoming conceited," see it's underlined there, "because of surpassing greatness of revelations, the thorn was given me in flesh, a messenger from Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited." So it repeats this in there. There's a reason, when the scriptures repeat something, there's an emphasis thing that's going on there. So what was this thorn in the flesh that Paul talks about? Well, we can't say for sure. Beyond the purposes of that it produced humility in his life, it produced dependence upon God. It was something, he says, that was ultimately sourced in Satan himself, who gave it to him. But Paul was given this, and apparently on 3 occasions, Paul went very specifically to the Lord to ask that this thing could be removed from his life, whatever it is. And we see that God, he says, allowed it to stay in his life so as to produce ultimately greater good and results than would be otherwise achieved. So what was this malady in the flesh it would seem to be talking about? Suggestions have been made of various physical ailments. We really don't know. I think the 2 maybe best suggestions of what it could possibly been, it might have been an eye problem, some kind of poor vision kind of thing, even something that was kind of even grotesque to look at. Or a second suggestion that I think makes maybe some sense, and even with some of the passages we've read, that perhaps it was a speech malady of some sort that would take away from the personal impression that he would make as a presenter. And so we don't know exactly what it was that Paul struggled with. But in any event, the answer that he got from the Lord is that God's sustaining grace would be sufficient for him to endure this in the midst of the problem, and that God's power was more evident in the midst of this obvious weakness. I mean, really? Why is that? That seems to be a bit counterintuitive also. But, we have seen that kind of thing in people. We know of people who have some sort of a malady in their life, something that they suffer with, that they have to deal with all the time. And because of that, and because of the way that God sustains them through it, and the way they're able to talk about it, it positions them to have real authority when they speak. We may think of like veterans would come to mind. I had a World War II veteran guy in my church in New Jersey, and he was really an amazing guy, kind of a simple guy and by life and all of that, but he had seen some of the worst of the fighting in the European theater. He rode in the 2nd tank across the Remagen Bridge over the Rhine in the invasion in Germany. And a couple miles into Germany, he had positioned his men in a variety of foxholes and got into one himself. He said obviously the Germans had watched. They picked him out as an officer. They dropped a shell right into his foxhole. It blew half his face off. And he was evacuated out of there, and he spent years having portions of his face put back together. His tongue was mostly blown off in this explosion. And so he had a very misshapen jaw and face, and it was difficult sometimes to understand him. But man, when that guy got up to speak about God and about how God had taken him through that war, how God had sustained him through that war, I mean, man, that guy had authority because of what you could see as well as what you could hear, the weakness that was there. So Paul gives a conclusion here in verses 9 and 10. He says, "Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul says, I love counterintuitive stuff. That would make a great sermon series title. Hey, he says this is where the real blessing and real boasting can take place. The thing that appears to be a great loss can actually be, in God, a great win. He had learned that when he was weak, that Christ's power was strongest in him and through him. He had learned that this is the way to be most effective for the Lord. So this was something to be happy about, to be content about having. And all the bad things, that seemingly bad things that happened to him, were in fact prime contributors to all the grand things and great things that were happening through him. So as we conclude today, what can we take away from this passage? Can we list some takeaway points? Let me give you three quickly to take away. The first is to say that earthly, worldly credentials are ultimately of minimal value. They're of minimal value. I mean, we're very tuned in to outward appearances, to beauty and success. I often see and hear a great vocal musician, say a woman who sings, who looks even better than she sounds. And I'll think to myself, if she sang this well but was actually a physically unattractive person, would she still be on stage? We're drawn to that which is attractive, right? We're moved to notice the other accoutrements of success in people, of wealth, of houses, of cars and dress and membership associations and relationships and so forth. And we even do the same thing in the Christian realm, don't we? We're impressed by what seems to be the outward signs of success. I often share the story of just this one weird segment of our lives for Diana and me when we were in Dallas, and I had those years of serving in a church with all these extraordinarily wealthy people, and but there were other people who came to the church and some of those more ordinary people who come to more middle-class kinds of people who come to the church, and they knew they could talk with me because I had the worst car in the parking lot of them all, being a seminary student, and they would say things like, you know, when we first came to the church here, there are several Sundays we drove through the parking lot and we saw the cars, and we weren't sure whether we could come in and fit in, but we're so glad, though, that we did, because we found that we really were welcomed, even though we're not like a lot of the other folks. But, you know, we see those things. We see those accoutrements, as I call them, of success. And there was even a church down there in Dallas that built a landing strip for people to fly in on their airplanes. Now, we had a couple of guys here. You'd probably like that. You might fly to church once in a while. You know what I'm thinking. But, you know, what do you think of that church? You go by and there's their own airfield kind of thing, you know, for the people to come to church. I mean, what's that kind of saying, you know? And but you know what? I was saying to some people today, you know what we need to put, not an landing strip, we need to put a marina right out front there in the lower parking lot. That's where we've been headed, you know. Yeah, I know, I got some amen from the amen corner of the boating community over here. But, you know, but beyond wealth indicators, we're impressed. When we look at some of the biggest churches that seem to be the most blessed with the greatest speakers and the most fantastic worship team and band, and we say, man, all of that, yes, that has to be obviously God's blessings and success, right? Right? Well, it might be, and I think often it is, but maybe not always. Not always. And I think I've told the story of Becky Conrad's father, Nick Britton, who passed away over a year ago and did his service. And I shared at the service, you know, if you knew Nick was one of these guys, he just loved people. He just saw everything he did in life. It was ordained of God. And he would meet you, and he'd start talking with you, and he'd want to know all about you, and he'd want to pray for you, and after a while, you'd have to fake your own death to get away from him, you know? But he just loved you. He loved you so much, you know? And Nick had this little church, but he loved his people, and those people loved him. And right before that service, I had gone to Dallas to a conference in a It was sponsored by a big church down in Dallas, and the guy who's the pastor there, I'm not going to use his name, you'd all know it. If you heard it, we went to seminary together. He knows who I am. My church that I talked about got his church started. We did music things together. He knows who I am. I hadn't seen him in years. I'm at the conference. I went up and said hello to him and said, hey, it's been a few decades, but I know I look a little older maybe, but I'm Randy, and oh, yeah, that's nice. Do you ever have this with important people? They're talking with you, and while they're talking with you, they're doing this thing to move on, The guy, he blew me off. He just totally blew me off. And Nick would never blow off anyone. Nick loved you. He cared for you because even though you wouldn't say, he has all these symbols of success, as we call success in a world, he really had success of knowing and loving people, wanting God to work through him. For us to only honor worldly credentials and skills alone is to be merely intuitive, not counterintuitive, merely instinctual senses that we recognize are merely of this world, that are not cognizant of a larger picture. So, second thing beyond that is that deficiencies position us to receive Christ's sufficiencies. Our deficiencies open us for his sufficiencies. It's true that natural skills and the work of the flesh can take some people who are gifted a long way, real far, but honestly, ultimately, not far enough. It's commendable, it's responsible to work hard and to seek to achieve, but at some point, the true work of serving God is a spiritual work that needs a spiritual empowerment. It was early in 2 Corinthians that Paul wrote in chapter 2. He said, but thanks be to God, who in Christ always leads us in triumphal procession, and through us spreads the fragrance of the knowledge of him everywhere. For we are an aroma of Christ, of God, to go among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing. To the one we're a fragrance of death, to the other a fragrance of life to life. Who is sufficient for these things? He said about ministry, who's sufficient to do these things? And then in the next chapter, he answers his own question. He says, not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything as coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God, who has made us sufficient to be ministers of a new covenant. I always like it when a problem or difficulty gets to the point that it's so big and I'm exhausted in trying to figure it out. It's like, okay, I've done what I can do about it. I've been responsible. Okay, God, you're going to have to take it from here. And there are a lot of times in ministry where things are like that, where you're not sure what to do. You're not sure what to say. I referenced that friend of mine that I saw this week, that one that I had known as my best friend growing up in childhood, and knew him even then somewhat as adults and raising families for a while in the same area. I went to see him this week, and because he's going to be dying here in the next week or two. Pancreatic cancer, he's not going to make it. And I'm walking into his house, and it's one of those times where it's God, I don't know what I'm going to say. God, you're going to have to help me here in this visit. In this next hour and a half, whatever it is, Lord, you're going to have to help me. We had a magnificent time together. But there are things where we can't do it. There's one where it's obvious, but really, most everything is like that. We need God to go with us for us to be successful in what he does through us. Just being people who love others, who care about the church near and far, who care about generations. That's what we want to do as a church. I don't know how to do church anymore. I admit it. I'm lost. I have no idea. I used to think I knew about how to run churches. I don't know anything about it. All I know to do is be faithful, do the main things that we need to do to be responsible, loving others, caring about what God's doing around the world. We want to be a church that brings along generations because the scriptures talk a lot about it. We want to do that, and we want to just serve together. Well, we do that, and let's be faithful, and I think it'll be all right. God's going to have to take it the rest of the way. But then third thing, our weaknesses are windows for God's power and to be seen. Let me ask you, back in January, why did nearly 1,000 people come into this room, into this building for the memorial service for Dave Swasina, and why did thousands of more people watch it online? Was it because of his exceptional giftedness and extraordinary abilities as a public figure? Well, certainly he was a capable person, but the reason so many came was because he let God work through him everywhere he went. He believed that everything he did, that everyone he met was a divine appointment. Even in the most simple moments of life and the person that he meets in the street, everything was a divine appointment. Dave saw his life as a window through which God's power could be seen. So this whole counterintuitive thing of strength or weakness, why does it work? And here's why. It's because when we recognize our weakness and even embrace our sufferings, when we do that, we are being most like Jesus himself. The scriptures say that Christ was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. When we serve others, when we are ridiculed in the midst of that, when we suffer persecution, when we submit to the frailties of life in a fallen world, then we are most like Christ, who did all of those things, depending daily, even though as a Son of God, depending daily on God through prayer, that God would work through him in submission and obedience. So here's the primary idea of the day. We sum it up and condense it into a single statement. I've used this statement over the years with you from time to time. If you get this concept of how God deals with people, I don't know anything better that you can get. You get this, you've really got something of value. God allows things to happen to us so that things can happen in us so that ministry can happen through us. When you understand that, you got something. And when you understand that, you're not just being instinctual. You're beyond instinct. You're beyond intuition. You're beyond intuitive. You are counterintuitive. Father, help us to be that kind of people, that kind of person, day to day, who submits to you, believing that where we have strength, where we have success, it will be because our weakness is turned around to great good and gain by you working through us, making us a window of your grace. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.